Thanks everyone for coming out. It's really a pleasure, honor to be here with this important community. We're going to speak today about some work we've been doing with a large group, and it's titled Research Quality Plus for Co-Production. I'm Rob, and Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Both Rob and I live in Ottawa, and you can go to the next slide, which is on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Algonquin people. And if you'd like to put in the territories to which you're on, you can put that into the chat. Next slide, please. Janet Jull, who was one of my postdocs, while she was doing her postdoc, we got funding to actually produce this training program. There's 4 modules, and it's actually about how to work in partnership, do co-production with Indigenous communities. And so I would point you to this training resource if you're thinking of working with Indigenous groups. Next, please.
I actually took this, Ian, on our holiday in Canada as my activity to learn in advance, and I really appreciated it. So thanks. I don't think I've told you that before. Um, just a few quick declarations. I think most of this was said in our introductions. I work at IDRC. I'll say a bit more about who and what that is shortly. But I've been involved in research evaluation for some time. I'm currently representing Global Research Council as a member of the Responsible Research Assessment Working Group. Previous to this, I worked at CIHR as a research evaluator, so I have some degree of knowledge of the Canadian research funding system and the role of research evaluation in it. And I'm not funded by industry.
And I think probably the most relevant aspect of my biography related to this presentation is as the scientific director for the Knowledge Translation Research Network, the IKTRN, which is a CIHR funded. It was a foundation, one of the inaugural foundation grants that was issued by CIHR in, I think, 2015, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I've been involved in editing these 2 books, which are more specifically about integrated knowledge translation and co-production.
So just to go over what we're hoping to deliver today and convey is these 3 objectives. So first, we wanted to talk about the concept of research co-production briefly, but then really speak a bit to the framework that we've developed to address the design, the management, the evaluation of co-production research. And we'll get into some depth how you might apply this framework in an evaluation of co-production research that you might be doing, or a way to use it just to reflect on your own practice. But we wanted to give a bit of background on kind of where we're coming from here and what drove us to develop this. And so just a personal reflection on my part. I first met Ian when I joined CIHR in 2010, I think it was. It's almost 15 years ago. And one of the many assignments I had as an evaluator at CIHR was to evaluate the program that Ian was leading, which was the Knowledge Translation Funding Program at CIHR. And in that work, a large focus was on what CIHR calls integrated knowledge translation funding opportunities. So co-produced research. We'll get a bit into the synonyms here in a second. But I learned a great deal from researchers, from the funders, from the community at large through this exercise about the potential and the value and the meaning of this work for really transforming Canada's health system and improving health outcomes for Canadians and globally, I'd argue. There's a couple nice quotes there from both researchers who got these grants and from what CHR calls knowledge users. So the non-research, I don't like to use that word, but the one who's not an academy-based member of the research team, who's bringing knowledge from another sector into the work. So currently, though, I'm at IDRC, which is a Canadian organization which funds research for and by the Global South. So I'm leading a program there that looks at the intersection of climate and health. And one thing I certainly am bringing to this work is the importance of views, perspectives, knowledge that comes from outside the academy. So rigorous methods are incredibly pertinent for understanding how climate and environment is affecting human health. But so is indigenous knowledge. So is activist knowledge. So are all the different perspectives that play important roles in really understanding the environment around us and the effects and the ways it balances and changes our health.
One more click, please, Rob. Um, and this was an interesting exercise for me, kind of thinking back over time, my interest in integrated KT, and it started as a PhD student, and I wanted my research to be useful. And so I wrote to the Federal Minister of Health and Welfare saying I was in sociology and focusing on medical sociology, and I wondered if the department had research questions that they wanted answered and whether I might be able to work with them on answering those questions or if they had databases and they had questions that they wanted answered from the databases. And I sent off the letter and I received a lovely response back from the minister's office explaining to me that the choice of a thesis topic was something that was to be done between the student and the supervisor, and that there was no role for the Minister of Health to be involved in that process. So a completely failed attempt at trying to work in a collaborative kind of way. And then I finished my PhD and came to Ottawa, and I was a postdoc for a few years at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. And then they actually gave me a position as a scientist and I started to work with nursing colleagues and physicians. And that's when I would say I started doing co-production or integrated KT, working with groups who wanted to improve the use of evidence, make their services more evidence informed and effective, and then working alongside to come up with processes and strategies to help facilitate that. And then in 2006, I was seconded to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research as the Vice President of Knowledge Translation. And one of the key things that I did while I was there was to champion what we then called integrated knowledge translation. We actually coined the term. Our first thoughts was we should call it embedded knowledge translation, but some of the wars in the Middle East that Canada was involved with was happening at the same time, and they had embedded journalists with military units, and that was getting negative publicity. And the view at the time was we shouldn't use the word embedded because of the negative connotations because of the war efforts. And so we had to come up with a different term, and so we decided to call it integrated knowledge translation. And the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation, and Jonathan Lomas was the CEO, they had a funding program called Partnerships for Health System Improvement, where they required researchers to partner, have a co-lead who was from the health system. And they had a merit review process where the funding was actually assessed in terms of the scientific excellence, but also the potential relevance and impact the research would had. And that program was transferred to CIHR when I started. And so I was involved in the transferring it from CHSRF to CIHR. And then I think if you can do another click for me. Um, one more. And so we actually, in the years that I was there, set up a number of programs that were specifically designed to support partnered integrated knowledge translation. So there were Planning and partnership development grants, small amounts of money up to $25,000 to bring people together to plan collaboratively what their projects were about. The Partnership for Health System Improvement grant, which I just mentioned, that came from CHSRF, busy. We had a Knowledge to Action grant, which was 2 years that required knowledge user co-leads and knowledge synthesis. And so you could be doing synthesis, but you had to have a knowledge user, so someone who would use the findings as a co-lead on those grants. And so this was essentially this page was what Rob was evaluating, the extent to which all of the KT programming were actually helping to achieve the objective. And the objective for CIHR was the improved health of Canadians and more effective and efficient health services and products ultimately. One more, please. And then my time at CIHR ended, and I came back to the University of Ottawa and to OHRI. And CIHR by this time had created the foundation grant, so it was block funding. Originally, it was for 7 years. And if you got one, you got a load of money. And you had it for 7 years, but it also meant that you couldn't apply for more funding until you were finished your foundation grant. And with COVID and then an extension in time, we've actually been able to spread out the money that we had until this year. And I think we have until March of next year to completely spend down what we've got. And so the purpose of the foundation grant was really to study research co-production. And then yesterday, I signed the papers and an interchange agreement with CIHR. And so I'm going back as an embedded scholar for 30% of my time to help advise on knowledge mobilization and other priorities that the president of CIHR thinks that I might be helpful on. So just a little bit about the integrated knowledge translation research. So our tagline is doing research with the people who use it. So the notion of we've got researchers, we've got people who will use research findings. How do we get them together and produce research? And so our mission is just that, to bring knowledge users and researchers together to advance the science and practice of integrated knowledge translation and to train the next generation of integrated knowledge translation researchers. And so that was the term until about 2021. And at that point, CIHR announced in its next strategic priorities that they were changing the preferred term from knowledge translation to knowledge mobilization. And so for the last little while, it's not been clear whether CIHR was still using the term integrated knowledge translation or whether it was going to be integrated knowledge mobilization. But CIHR in some of their documents have actually started to refer to this concept of working together as research co-production. And so in the midst of our foundation grant, we started shifting away from the term integrated knowledge translation, which is a Canadian term and often isn't understood outside of our borders, to co-production. And the goals of the IKTRN were to advance the understanding of the concept of IKT from the perspective of knowledge users, researchers, funders, and universities, to assess the impacts of IKT, and this presentation really falls under that goal, develop and adapt IKT theories and measurement tools, and convert evidence gained from the research program into accessible resources and build IKT research capacity. And we have, the network has over 100 researchers and knowledge users. And I think we have over the years between 30 and 40 trainees who have been part of the network. So research co-production, just so that we're on the same page, this is how we defined it for RQ Plus for co-production project. Co-production is an umbrella term used to describe the process of generating knowledge through partnerships between researchers and those who will use or benefit from research. Together, a co-production team aims to identify problems we're solving, design a research strategy that makes sense to all involved, interpret the meaning and merit of what's discovered for each party, and share and possibly implement the findings in a collaborative way. Um, and over the years, if we kind of think of since the early 2000s, there's been a growing appreciation and interest in the concept of research co-production. And so it's been variously labeled as integrated knowledge translation, research co-production, Mo2, knowledge production, engaged scholarship, community-based participatory research, action research. And Tram Nguyen did a concept analysis of some of the terms and actually found that there were more similarities in what these different approaches were trying to achieve than there were differences, although there are differences. Next, please. And so in about 2018, the network, we put out a call to our network saying, would you like to write concept papers on integrated KT around what we see as some of the issues? What are the things we should be thinking about? How should the field proceed? And I think in the end, there was something like 21 or 23 papers that were published. The ones that were published in BMC journals were put together as a series, and you can go and find them. And last year we had another call, and we have 15 papers out to BMC journals. 5 of them have already been accepted, and we're waiting to hear on the other 9. They're all under review, and some of them are in the process of revisions to address reviewers' comments.
So it's really interesting. It's the domain of research co-production, we believe, is growing not just in the scholarship, in the way that scholarship is happening too. And so I'm not a representative of this journal, but there are now journals that focus on this topic specifically, and are actually co-producing the way that they publish. So actually changing the way of review and the way that that review happens, not just in the academic sphere. So we're seeing this notion of co-production popping up outside of just scholarship, but in the way that scholarship is happening.
And the journal Nature, which is extremely credible in the sciences, in 28 had a special series on co-production, not specifically in health, but the notion of why is it important that researchers start partnering with and doing research that is responding to the needs of people that are out there as opposed to being purely curiosity driven research. And so if something like co-production is being picked up by Nature, I think it's a good indication that there's openness in science to actually thinking about this different way, more participatory way of doing research.
And I mentioned earlier, I'm working with the Global Research Council. So that is the global consortium of national funders. So the funders from each country that are government based. And every year we work to put out statements of principles. And in 2025, the statement on co-creation of knowledge was issued. So there were 2 statements, and one was on AI and its role in and for research, and one on co-creation. So the prioritization of this issue also seems very relevant amongst funders globally.
And if we think about funders like CIHR, and I described already that earlier in the 2010s, CIHR had funding opportunities dedicated to support integrated knowledge translation, had merit review, which included researchers and knowledge users who assessed both the relevance and the potential impact. And you need to score high on both in order to get funded. And then over time, CIHR thought that these programs were so effective that they would roll them into the uh, project um, program, which is the largest funding opportunity. And so if you want to work in partnership when you put in your grant proposal, you would just say that you do that and that there wasn't necessarily a need anymore um, to support um, funding opportunity specific grants for IKT. Um, there's a new president at CIHR. Um, there's a knowledge mobilization action plan, which will be coming out and went through a lot of consultation. So I would just suggest that you watch the CIHR space, and maybe there will be um, new funding opportunities for those of us who want to work in more collaborative and participatory ways.
And at IDRC too, we've just released a new strategy that goes to 2030. And there are three pillars. One is about producing high quality research. One is about sharing the knowledge that's produced. And the third is about mobilizing alliances. And co-production as a strategy for doing and sharing knowledge fits across those three pillars. So we've really embedded this way of generating, sharing, implementing, scaling knowledge across all of the work we're doing at IDRC. So we're really seeing this kind of come to the forefront in Canada. And we thought to really dig into this, we should take a look at our own community and examine how this issue is represented here at the Knowledge Translation Canada Seminar Series.
And so since 2008, there's been 145 seminars, and 35 of those, so 24% of all of the KT Canada seminars, have been about integrated KT or co-production. So that's like a quarter, pretty impressive. Next. And one more time, if we look at it over time as a time series, so there were 45 seminars between 2010 and 2014. So about 11% of them actually focused on co-production. Next, please. Then between 2015 and 2019, it went up to 21% of those. And then between 20 and 24, it went up to 37%. And once more, all of the series for 2025 so far have actually had something to say about research co-production. So clearly within this community, our community, research co-production is something that has a lot of interest.
Okay, so into what we want to talk about today. We'll return to this statement that Ian introduced. I just want to highlight kind of two important points here. One is the umbrella term. So it's a word we're going to use. If you prefer to use CBPR, participatory action research, IKT, please do. Our aim is to be inclusive of the many traditions and not to say that this is different or you know better than. The other important term, though, here is actually the title, co-production. And we wanted to say a little bit about the provenance of that notion. And to my understanding, really the first popular use of co-production was forwarded by Ellie Ostrom, who was a economist. She's actually the first female economist to win the Nobel Prize for economics, which she won for her work on collaborative processes, largely in how governments and markets work together to create optimal outcomes. Whether or not there should be a Nobel Prize for economics is another question that we won't address. But I love this quote here, and I really think this speaks to the root of what we're trying to get at with our framework. And probably not to say that the bureaucrats and the politicians are the ones we need to keep out of the challenge, but to bring them in. And it's to say that in this age, and I think this is an important quote in this age of the rise of technocracy and absolutism, that it's through inclusion and understanding and coming together that we can actually achieve more and possibly better. Um, so I think this is just a fantastic kind of impetus for where we're coming from, and part of the reason why we've embraced that term specifically in our work. Um, but through our efforts over the years, Ian and I have noticed that doing and supporting and funding co-production, there is one major stumbling block, and it's been in the domain of evaluation. And in our concept chapter and in a protocol that we published to develop this framework, we pull that apart in some detail. And so here's a table, and you don't need to read all the words. I'll go over this quickly, but basically to say that the way that co-production has been traditionally assessed or valued in the academic system has really been at odds with what's at the root of co-production, what our aims are. And so at a very high level, we can think about three kind of main approaches to evaluation of research that are used. The first is deliberative, and that really looks like peer review, which is happening at many stages. So our peers are saying if our grants are appropriate for funding, if our papers should be published, if we should be speaking at conferences. And generally speaking, those peers are our scientific peers. And so, as we can imagine, their focus is on the scientific, methodological nature of our contributions and the knowledge we're generating, and not necessarily on elements that might matter to knowledge users or holders or beneficiaries. The second major form of evaluation that's used is what we've called analytic, and that's really the aggregation of deliberative reviews. So this takes form in our H indices, in our journal impact factors, in our university world rankings. And so these are really just quantitative reductions of the number of times we've done something scientific and how much other people like it. Interesting, other scientists. Interestingly, that seems to say nothing about the value of science for those who might use or benefit from the work we're doing. And so co-produced research is really not generally going to be well assessed using these types of analytic measures. And then finally, what's been growing and of increasing interest to many in the science kind of enterprise is the notion of research impact assessments. So oftentimes this can look like case studies or long-term retrospective studies of the way that research is shaping and changing our world. And at first glance, that seems exciting for co-production. But at the work we've looked at, it rarely becomes a focus of what the research impact assessment is saying. And the interest seems to lie on what kind of outcomes have been generated, what kind of impact has created, less on the process and less on really understanding the role of those who aren't traditional academics, who are funded by or working for the institutions funding these types of studies. So if you'd like to see more about the kind of gap in evaluation, take a look at some of this work where we pull that apart and try to point to where there is room for improvement. One important kind of nuance about what we're presenting with RQ Plus for CoPro is that it has a clear focus. And so this is a diagram we use at IDRC to talk about the way that research has an impact in the world. And kind of moving through these spheres of control, influence, and interest. So from what we fund to what impact we hope to generate in the world with knowledge. RQ Plus for CoPro allows for this very specific focus on what is within our sphere of control. So rather than waiting the 17 to hundreds of years that it takes for knowledge to reach its full benefit to people and planet, we can actually look at studies we're funding, look at work that's undergone, happening right now, and that's been recently completed, and look for these different dimensions of quality. So hence the term research quality plus within co-production. And it's our argument that these are predictors and drivers of longer term impact.
So the IKTRN, um, really, many of us working in the area and thinking about it um, realized that we need to figure out much better how the process of doing research co-production actually works and what does it produce and what are the effects of those things that are produced. And so if we think about the underlying theory of change or the program theory, um, researchers and knowledge users working together are more likely to produce useful and usable findings that actually make their way into decision making and are acted upon. And if that happens, then you're going to see improvements in health outcomes, efficiencies in the health system, or whatever other impacts. They could be societal ones for that matter. And another piece to this is the belief that by having uh, researchers and users of research working together through the research process, there's actually mutual learning. There's capacity building. So researchers actually get to understand the real world context in which the research has relevance. And the knowledge users acquire more knowledge and appreciation of the value of research and why rigorousness is important and all of those kinds of things. And so breaking down these silos um, between researchers and knowledge users. We also realized that there tended to be, in terms of the discussions around impact, oftentimes some confusion about what's the effect of working in a collaborative way on the team, on the project, the decisions made by the team, and therefore the outputs that come from that team versus how do the outputs from research that's been co-produced have an impact? So that's kind of a little bit of the backstory for why we thought that it was important to actually have a framework that could be used, could be tested to see how does co-production happen? What's the quality of that process of working together? And then how is that related to what comes out at the other end in terms of impacts? And of course, the other piece is all of this has relevance to the reporting, because if you're actually trying to make the causal connections, you need to know. So if a team says, and you've probably seen this in the literature, you often see it in grant proposals, we're using a co-production approach, but there's no clue what that actually means. Does it just mean that they have a friend who's a knowledge user who they're using as the knowledge user, or they actually are using principles to decide how they want to work together. They have strategies and activities that facilitate and nurture those interactions because it's co-production is all about relationships. Um, and so authors, grant writers may actually do all sorts of things that are appropriate for co-production, but if they don't tell you that, there's no way to know. So this also has implications for reporting. So by knowledge users, um, we're talking about anybody who could use the findings. So they could be patients, they could be clinicians, they could be policymakers, potentially industry, um, could be researchers in other disciplines. So moving something from chemistry into physics. The physicist could be seen in that kind of a project as a knowledge user. So the history, so the foundational work is actually RQ plus from IDRC. a lot of research has gone into it. IDRC uses the RQ Plus process to evaluate the work that they do. They bring in and create teams of researchers who assess uh, the grants that they've issued. Uh, they use the documents that are produced by the team. They interact with the team and actually assess the quality. And so RQ Plus for co-production started with that as the foundation. There's a chapter in this book that actually lays out kind of the approach to how we were thinking about um, research co-production and how to assess it and measure it based on the RQ Plus approach. Um, you you can see the protocol. So we actually made the adaptations to RQ Plus, and then members of the IKTRN volunteered to use their projects, and we paired them off into groups, and then they essentially used the framework to interrogate each other's projects so that we could learn from did did the adaptations we make sense? Was it useful? Did they feel that they were learning about the things that they thought were important to learn about related to co-production? And then the findings from that study have been published as well. And you can see if you just look at the list, a lot of different perspectives within the IKTRN are there. We've got people who study IKT and use IKT approaches in their work. We had Rob and others who brought research evaluation perspectives, both practicing and academic perspectives. We had research funders. Michael Smith Health Research was part of the team. We had a vice president of research from Dalhousie who was on the team, so university administration. We had advocacy and charitable organizations. We had the Canadian Cancer Society and the Australia National Disability Insurance Agency. And of course, we had trainees. And now Rob will walk you through RQ Plus for co-production.
Thanks, Ian. And so I'll do this quickly. And there's lots more to dig into the links we're sharing, and we're happy to follow up too with advice, discussion on practical implementation or implications of all of this. So RQ Plus for CoPro is really derived or based or comes from the three tenets that are embedded in Research Quality Plus, which Ian has described. And those three tenets are here on the screen. The first is that context matters. Research always happens in a context. And traditionally, we've tried to divorce that context from our evaluations of research. We blind reviewers, we blind assessments in order to increase objectivity. That's fine, and that can be useful. But in this approach, we're saying that having a look at context, as embracing it as part of the process that generates research, we could learn a great deal about how that context influences the work that's produced. The second tenet is that a holistic view of quality of co-production is multidimensional. And so we've tended to accept that science is good science if it's rigorous science. So if methods are reproducible, and we can replicate studies. Our view is that there are other dimensions which are equally important to understanding the quality of co-production. So we'll get into what these are specifically, but we expand beyond just rigor and methodological integrity into other issues that we argue are equally important to generating good, high quality co-production research. And the third tenet is that any evaluation of research co-production should hold the same standards as science itself. It should be empirical and systematic. It's very interesting, and I won't get into it in detail today, but I've had many conversations with probably some of you here. The the level of rigor that's so important in science that we put into assessing our own work. Peer review is derived from the opinion of an expert, and that wouldn't pass the test as a scientific conclusion in very many domains of research I know of. But it is the predominant way that we decide whether or not research is good or even acceptable. So those three tenets kind of are operationalized in the RQ Plus for CoPro framework, which is laid out here. And I'll speak a little to this. Ian, jump in if you want to elaborate and keep me on pace so I don't go in too much detail and get excited about any particular component. The contextual factors are derived from our study, our work. And we went to ask and find out what are the most important elements of context that matter for the production of research in a collaborative way. And at this stage, we've developed these three, and these aren't the only three. And if you want to see other contextual factors in your evaluations, that's fantastic, and you should. So this is a modular framework. What's important are those three tenets. They may be very different contextual factors that matter in your space, in your organization, in your evaluation questions. The three that are here, I think, are interesting and valuable, however. The first around knowledge use environment is really a look at the way that knowledge is used by the user element of the co-production team. So is knowledge seen as a legitimate, as kind of a useful, as a valid source of information for decision making? So oftentimes you're doing co-production in a place where that's not the case, where research isn't really a major driver of decisions. And it's interesting to know about how that environment is influencing the research process. The second contextual factor, the research environment, really deals with how accepting the research component is of the co-production of knowledge. So again, a lot of research environments seem to prioritize work that's done strictly in the ivory tower or by researchers. And the time it takes to build relationships, to establish co-production protocols collaboratively, might actually be a burden and hindering in one's career when they're judged on number of publications or amount, grant size, and the number of grants won, which can happen more quickly if you don't burden yourself with all the complications of listening to your community. And then finally, because it's important to really say, we hope this is a field building exercise, a development process for co-production of research. The notion of capacity for doing this work was highlighted as a very important contextual factor to pay attention to. So importantly, these are contextual factors, not judgment criteria. It's not to say that it's good or bad, the level of capacity in the grant, but that level of capacity for doing co-production can often be related to the quality of the science or not. So that takes us to the second tenet, the multiple dimensions of quality that we want to look at. And so through our work, we identified three main dimensions of quality and a number of subdimensions you see under each one. And so I'll go over this quite quickly. And if you follow the links, you can read the full descriptions and the matching rubrics and evaluation criteria for each one. But the first is rigor. So this is really the notion that doing co-production can increase the accuracy of what we know. So instead of just having one perspective at the table using one method that's prioritized by this one group, we might actually know more accurately about the world by bringing multiple perspectives and experiences to solving a particular problem. The second dimension has to do with legitimacy. So it's not so much about accuracy, but it might be about validity. So is what we know actually meaningful, useful, beneficial to everyone who's in this system or affected by the particular problem we're investigating? So in terms of legitimacy of knowledge, we look at four different criteria here around the inclusion of local knowledge and local ways of knowing, trust and power, and mutually beneficial partnerships within the co-production process, intersectionalities of power are addressed, and also attention to potentially negative consequences of the research, either through the process or the outcome. And I think that's a really important piece to highlight and have a look at. We assume our work in research and is always good, and I think actually one of the considerations we should be making as champions of co-production research is I think it increases the potential for doing harm with research if we don't do it carefully, and with care and thoughtfulness. So the final dimension is positioning for use. And so this really has to do with doing co-production can lead to more useful research or knowledge. So the sub-dimensions here are really about the relevance of the work that's being done and about its openness and actionability for those who are meant to use it. And to illustrate the third component and how it's operationalized in the framework, I'm going to go to a next slide that gives an example of just one of the evaluative rubrics within RQ Plus for CoPro. And so what we've done is taken that subdimension on inclusion of local knowledge and ways of knowing, and we've done this for each of the dimensions, uh, illustrated it over a quantitative scale that can be used for quantitative ratings of a project, but also provided qualitative detail so that the assessment can be done systematically. And also an opportunity for a reviewer or an evaluator to provide comments and justification in a qualitative way. So how they've reached that decision, that rating they've given, why that rating is where they've positioned it. And so it's really a method that is systematic, but also allows the collection of quantitative and qualitative data for further assessment or synthesis and use. And so as we've produced this framework and begun to test it in the field test and put it to use in certain settings, we began to realize that it really may have value beyond the evaluation or post hoc evaluation stage. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about how it could be a framework that's used before, during, and after co-production research. It could be used in different ways. So not as a quantitative scoring rubric, but as a discussion guide that you could use with your knowledge users or knowledge holders to really dig out some of those important elements of co-production that seem to drive impact. It could be used during the process of managing a co-production research project as a checklist or just as a meeting kind of orientation checklist to talk about how are we addressing each of these issues as we go and checking in on them because we often write elaborate protocols for doing our work, but rarely go back to assessing how when things change, we've changed, but kept true to our original purpose. And finally, after, I mean, I think there are multiple entry points to using a more sophisticated, rigorous, and legitimate approach to evaluating co-production across the research enterprise. Which brings us to this next slide that we're arguing that it's not just the co-producers who need to use this to advance the quality of their work, but if we really want to see acceptance and systems change around how we value co-production research and the kind of impact it's having in the world, we need to bring other actors in that system to the table as well. And so there's some short cases here on how different power holders in the research enterprise could use a framework such as co-production, RQ Plus for co-production, to begin to walk the talk of what's becoming, as we illustrated earlier, I hope convincingly, an increasingly important and popular topic across the research system. And so we go into how funders could use it, and excited to say, I'll speak in a second how we are using it at IDRC to experiment with knowing more about the co-production research we want to fund and the benefits we hope it can generate. But we think too that actors like publishers could use it in ways to assess papers or research outputs in different and more challenging or sophisticated, I should say, ways. and also universities who are increasingly championing, social impact and being positive actors in communities, but have very few methods for actually evaluating or incentivizing that type of activity amongst faculty, and might actually start to build incentives, reward systems, tenure, and advancement systems that rely on those more um, you know, lesser popular elements that are so important to co-production around legitimacy and positioning for use. So, as we've used and developed this, we certainly see there are some limitations and needs for future work. And we just wanted to quickly highlight a couple here is using a framework of this type is definitely more difficult than the opinion of a peer on whether or not, say, a finished study is publishable. There are multiple elements that need to be assessed. We encourage reviewers to collect multiple sources of evidence and empirical evidence, so actually talk to researchers and research beneficiaries who are part of the co-production process. However, the root approach is based on those same three tenets, which are implied in RQ Plus for CoPro, but are derived from RQ Plus, that we're using at IDRC. And through all our applications of RQ Plus at IDRC, we have heard resoundingly that the return on investment is significant. So the actual knowledge generated for decision making, for improvement, for strategy development has been well worth the time and effort put into the evaluations done. And I think that's really the best feedback you could have on was an evaluation a good investment or not. And the second point here, which is both future work and an important kind of caution, is that we have not impact assessed, what using this framework is going to do, and we're hoping to do work on that in the future. And one piece of work that we're launching right now, and is very exciting to us, is this evaluation that will use RQ Plus for CoPro as its framework. And so this is an evaluation of the Women Rise program, which was funded by IDRC, CIHR, and SSHRC. And the program funded 24 research projects, large research projects, I think over 1 million, I believe, each. It's quite a large investment. And they were each designed as co-production projects. So there was a principal investigator, a principal knowledge user, and a community lead in each of the projects who were meant to come together, work as a team to co-produce knowledge. And so the evaluation framework selected for the evaluation of this large program, funded by the tri-agencies and IDRC, will be RQ Plus for CoPro, and we're excited to see what this can teach us about how funders are engaging in co-production and how we can do better to support it in the academic community. So just a nod here to the kind of leaders in the field who will be doing this evaluation, to Manuel, Connie, and Diego. And I'm also very pleased that IDRC has elected to make an additional investment. So not just in producing a report on the assessment of this program, but investing in what's learned about co-production through this evaluation, and also what's learned about the framework and how it's useful or not to assessing this type of program. So that's very exciting kind of contribution to building knowledge in the co-production domain. So that wraps us up, and we hope this was enjoyable and informative. And we're very close to our time, unfortunately, but we will say thank you and pass it back to you, Megan. Unless you wanted to add anything, Ian.
Yes, there was a question which I will ask for the person. Are there measures of context?
Sorry, I'm just fumbling with my computer. Are you asking me?
Yep, I'm asking you.
If I understand correctly, yes, we have the three contextual factors set out, and within the framework, we actually have a rubric for mapping context. So we're very careful not to say that we are assessing or judging context. The contextual factors are treated quite differently. They're a tool for understanding or mapping context rather than saying it's good or bad or placing a value judgment on it. Because we've learned through the RQ Plus approach that by understanding context, we can know a great deal about drivers of quality, and what kind of investment needs to be made and where efforts should be placed by having that better understanding of context. So I hope that answers it, if I understood correctly. And thank you, Ginny, for your comment in the I just see pop up in the chat. I completely agree. So although you could use this framework to make an evaluative judgment, we are certainly arguing that it has a great deal of potential beyond that to understand, to advocate, to improve, which may be very different than reaching evaluative conclusions.
Well, we're pretty much at our time here. So I'm going to pop the link for the evaluation in the chat here. It would be great to get everyone's feedback and help us, plan our future sessions. So thank you so much, Rob and Ian, for presenting for us today. That was a really fantastic, lots of great information. I want to let everybody know that our next webinar will be on June 26th. It's going to be with Cody Primo, and they'll be talking about their work using a citizen science approach to engage with underrepresented communities. So please register for that. And yeah, and thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining. And thanks again, Rob and Ian, for a fantastic presentation. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you.
care.